Good afternoon. This is Media Center Ukraine and Odesa. We continue for today. And the second briefing is dedicated to the problems of agrarians in the Odesa region and in Ukraine. I'd like to introduce our guests, Markiyan Dmytrasevich, Deputy Minister of Agrarian Policy and Food of Ukraine, and Alla Stoyanova, Director of the Department of Agrarian Policy, Food and Land Relations of the Odesa Regional Military Administration. The floor is yours for a short introduction, and then we can have answers from our journalists. Good afternoon. Would like to welcome all our viewers and listeners. Today we participate in the Odesa Reconstruction Forum. Odesa now is very important when it comes to agrarian expert. And we here don't mean only Odesa, but the ports of Odesa region. The Danube ports are now very important because they have become the main hubs and routes for our agrarian products. In parallel with the solidarity lanes with our international partners. We welcome the proposals of the Reconstruction Forum, and we will also have our offers for agrarian development. Alla, good afternoon. Today, Odesa is hosting a huge event. This is the first reconstruction or recovery forum. This is the first forum for Odesa and for this region in general. Odesa is a strategic region for the whole country. And we need to use the whole of our progress for the recovery plan. Because this plan is not only for the recovery, but also for the further development. Odesa region is a priority for amelioration reform, for fishery reform. Now we are leaders when it comes to the production of wine and winery products, the sheep breeding, and we are the leaders in rice production. And despite the war, we're the first when it comes to the production of wheat. So we need to get rid of the label of Ukraine as the raw material country. We need to develop processing, we need to create new jobs, we need to build new factories, and we need to have the added value to the products produced in our country. And thus, we will finally become a fully-fledged player at the world food market. Now we have several questions. The Austrian TV channel ORF has several questions to you, mainly, Mr. Dmytrasevich. So, the first question. Will the grain deal, the grain corridor, will be successful? Will it be continued? And how the ministry and grain traders plan their activities when it comes to grain deal? This question is asked every 4 months, so this is a traditional question. But this time, we've heard new statements from the Russian Federation. They believe that the Green Corridor has been prolonged for 60 days. It is very difficult to forecast any success here, because every time we face new misinformation and sabotage from the Russian Federation. Ukraine is important when it comes to the world food safety and security. And the UN is interested in the process as well as Turkey. And we continue negotiations, and we believe they will be successful. Are you discussing the extension of the ports involved in the grain deal? Now we are discussing the time frame. And of course, Ukraine also raises the issue of the expanded geography to include Mykolaiv ports. And we also propose to prolong it for at least 1 year. And of course, it is needed for our state, for our farmers, to be to some extent sure about the future and to plan our production. But we see that the Russian Federation speaks about shortening the period. What is the forecast for harvesting in Ukraine? Do you have some additional information about how many agricultural lands have been lost, how many have been recovered and demined? The preliminary forecast, if we can preserve the export through grain deal and solidarity lanes, is minus 10% in tonnage of our harvest and crops, but the price will increase because our farmers, taking into consideration the experience of heavy logistics, switch from corn and wheat, which is more difficult to harvest and transport, into such crops as soybean, rape, and sunflower. As for lands, 2.5 million hectares of Ukrainian lands have been mined or have been contaminated because of the war. So there are some projectiles that can be found there. There are also lands that require additional survey and additional checks to find mines and other explosives. And this is the latest number of the State Emergency Service. And this is also without, apart from the lands which are now occupied. 2.5 million hectares. What is the percentage of the whole agricultural lands? Around 20%. Yes, we don't take into consideration the occupied lands, but together with occupied lands and mined lands, we cannot use around 20% of our lands. And the last question from our Austrian colleagues. What is the problem of staff of the agrarian sector? Is there a lack of people there? We have now enough workers because we have the reservation procedure, but we understand that the war continues, the more people are mobilized to the armed forces of Ukraine. That's why it makes it more difficult to continue agrarian activities in Ukraine. Especially, this is the problem with the combiners, operators. They became drivers for tanks and armored vehicles. And the question now to Ms. Stoyanova. This is the question from Odesa mass media. How the sowing campaign is progressing in Odesa region? What are the peculiarities of this year? Odesa region is always a leader when it comes to sowing spring crops. We have the second sowing campaign for such crops during the martial law. The campaign is almost over. We still have to sow 100,000 hectares of corn. The 400,000 of hectares have been occupied now by sunflower. We have stopped the spring sowing campaign. The campaign is more stable this year, contrary to previous year, because last year we had the deterioration of different supply chains. Now it is clear where to buy seeds, where to buy fuel. The region has enough material resources and enough workers to continue its operation. The agrarian sector is quite robust right now, especially when it comes to the latest precipitation in Odesa in the south region. And usually we don't have so much precipitation. That's why our agrarians are now more optimistic. There have been several messages of the prohibition of exporting agrarian products to the EU. And yesterday there was the announcement that perhaps the exports would be banned by the 5th of June. What the ministry can do just to prevent this prohibition? But if there is the prohibition, how it can affect the Ukrainian export in general? The situation is the following. The minister had negotiations with the Polish party, and we started the negotiations at the beginning of the year. The last week, our minister had several meetings in Hungary and Romania, offline, and also had online calls with his colleagues. And we need to understand that this is not the prohibition of export, this is the prohibition of import to those countries. And this is especially an acute issue for Poland, and we understand their internal political situation. And we are ready for compromises, but we insist on the necessity of continuing transit through those countries, which is very important for our sector. We have been holding bilateral and multilateral consultations with the countries, with the European Commission. The European Commission, the European Parliament have been discussing also this issue, and we know that they also in negotiation with the 5 countries, and I think that you know that those countries have been offered an additional package aid for their farmers to the amount of 100 million euros. And we believe and we expect that in the next weeks we will be able to gain compromise. And now, Reuters is informing that the European Commission can ban the export of Ukrainian grain and oils to Romania by the 5th of June. On the 5th of June, the autonomous trade measures will be over. They were introduced last year by the European Union, European Commission, but we expect that these measures will be prolonged. And I think that there will be also certain provisions on the import of the Ukrainian agrarian products to the mentioned countries. Thank you. The question is about grain traders. Can all of them be involved in the grain treaty, in the grain deal, to export their grain? As far as I know, that there were more grain than it was possible to export. This is the question not to the Minister of Agrarian Policy, but this is the question to the seaport authority. There is some tension among exporters, and we know that unfortunately, because of the open, direct sabotage of the Russian party with regard to examination of vessels in Bosphorus, only several vessels are allowed per day. The situation is absurd. There, such vessels as WFP, these are the vessels of the UN World Food Program, could not actually leave Bosphorus last week. These surveys were more or less rhythmics, but Ukraine used the potential of Odesa port. So there were some tension, but we need to understand that this is because of the Russian aggression and the actions of Russian inspectors and inspector centers. How long should a commercial vessel wait now if it's not the UN vessel? How much time they have to spend in the queue there in Bosphorus? 2 days ago, around 70 vessels were on entry and 30 on exit. And recently, I've had a communication with this World Food Program, and they say that they need around months to plan the call to our ports. And as if I remember, they try to hinder this process. Russia tries to hinder this process. Yes, they do this on purpose. The Russian inspectors do this on purpose. Thank you. Thank you. These are all on questions on our side. And we have one more question. Yes. Alla, this is the question to you. And actually, Mr. Dmytrasevich, this is the question to you as well. Perhaps you have the numbers. What are the volumes of wheat and sunflowers, all grain crops, which they plan to harvest this year in thousands of tons in Odesa and in Ukraine in general? The preliminary forecast, 62-63 million tons of all crops. But of course, it depends on the weather conditions, on sowing campaign, on the export rhythm, so to say, on the export frequency, on the solidarity lanes and Green Deal. 63 million tons of all crops. Can you share the numbers by categories? Unfortunately, no. Yes, the forecast for the whole of Ukraine has improved, and in February the numbers were 46 million, but we were able to have enough precipitation. That's why the planned harvest has increased, and we have the updated numbers. As for the Odesa region, unfortunately, for example, in 2021, we had the biggest harvest for the whole history of Ukraine. We had 5 million tons of grains. And over the last year, we had 3,300,000 tons of grains and beans. This year, we plan to repeat the numbers of the last year, and if the harvesting campaign is successful, we'll be able to increase the forecast by 15%. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your answers. Thank you for being with us today. This is the last briefing for today. Please stay tuned to learn about our events the next week.